Okay, we're going to try this. I've tried doing this. We're going to talk about risk and security management. I've tried doing this, recording this a couple times, and as part of a class discussion, I keep having technical problems. So I thought I'd try doing it on my own. We can't talk about security management without talking about risk. It's a part of any kind of security, integral. You don't need security if you didn't have risk. Basically, risk is a situation involving exposure to danger. And as a noun or as a verb, you expose someone or something to danger, harm, or loss. We all deal with risk on a daily basis. Risk is all around us. From the time we leave the house, you can slip going down the front stairs, driving in your car. It's something we have to address. Both in our personal lives and as an organizational approach. One of the things that we have to understand about risk is that people take different positions on risk, and organizations do. Some of us are risk seekers. We enjoy risk. This mouse obviously is willing to take the risk to get that cheese, even though he's adopted at least one of the strategies that we're going to talk about for risk with his helmet. On the other hand, other people are risk averse, and this all may depend on the environment that you're in. If you're looking at, for example, personal retirement, as you get older, typically you take less risk. When you're younger, you want to grow your funds, so you take more risk. That's one of the things you have to understand is in a business perspective, you have to take some risk to have some kinds of gains. And that varies by company. Some companies are very conservative. Others are more risk acceptant and actually thrive on that kind of environment. Before I go on, one of the things that about risk and our approach to risk is that sometimes our perception of risk is a little bit different than the reality. I always ask my students, which is more dangerous, skydiving or driving in a car? And usually they'll know that it's a loaded question and they'll skydiving is safer, but most of us really think that driving in a car is safer. However, if you really get down to it, statistically, you're 24 times more likely to die in a car wreck than a skydiving accident. There's I think 3 million skydiving jumps in a year, usually average year, and only 21 deaths. I'm sorry, as opposed to cars where there's 40,000 accidents and 3,000 fatalities. So, how we perceive risk is going to influence how we try to implement risk security. This is a little bit too far. You could be so paralyzed by fear of risk that we are actually not achieving anything. So if you want to make a profit, you have to take some risk. So that's just a fact of life. It's a fact of business. Security, the state of being free from danger or threat. Actually, the reality is that we are never actually totally secure. It's all relative. There are always risks, so you can't be secure, truly secure. Risk management, and I like in business, the forecasting and evaluation of financial risk together with identification procedures to avoid or minimize their impact. This really sums up what we try to do in IT security and just general risk management. One of the things you'll find is that in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a large increase in the number of CISOs, or Chief Information Security Officers. Actually, that's kind of moving to Chief Risk Officers now, CROs, where they're actually realizing that risk needs to be managed as a holistic approach to all of the departments in a business. like you see so much in the security field, there is a life cycle. With risk, you need to identify it, assess, evaluate, control, and monitor. You're going to see this over and over again in all the security presentations and concepts, is that it's not a static process. You don't just do it once. Once you've gone through control and are controlling and monitoring, you go back and re-identify, reassess, reevaluate, control and monitor. Most breaches, in my opinion, occur because of complacency. We're compliant with the governance, risk management, and compliance, or the government regulations, so we're safe, and they don't necessarily equate. This is just a little bit more involved. It breaks it down in a few more steps, but it's the same model, and it's a fluid model. When measuring risk, you have to start out first, is there a risk? More of a qualitative yes, no. And then you're going to turn around and you'll probably do a more detailed or qualitative measurement. We look at some of the scales like this CVSS, the Common Vulnerability of System Security, where it does a very detailed breakdown of risk and the different factors that make up that risk. You really don't have a risk until three things are present. You have to have an asset that is of value. We talked about risk being the loss of an asset, of something of value. There has to be a vulnerability. There has to be a potential for harm. And finally, a threat. We're going to talk a little bit more in later lectures about threats. Threats, not just somebody saying something. Let me back up just a second. Before I get into threats, we're going to get into that, but let's talk a little bit more about assets. Typically, people think about assets as strictly dollar amounts, businesses, facilities, equipment. A lot of people don't realize that probably one of the biggest assets a company has is its employees that are trained, that can perform to do the business. A lot of businesses require skilled workers. You can't just get anybody, and it takes time and money to train those people up. The other asset that I think is overlooked a lot of times is goodwill. There have been some recent studies that after data breaches, 70% of the people would not utilize that company or buy from that company for several months. Of that, 25% probably will never go back to that company. So that's a major investment that a company builds up and tries to develop over time, that's worth a lot of money on its final, when it comes down to cutting a net profit. Asset, useful or valuable thing, person or quality, property owned, having regarded as having value and available to meet debts, commitments, and legacies. It can also be military assets. Vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities is the weakest link. I like this picture because it demonstrates you can have really strong links, and all it takes is one weakness. Vulnerabilities, quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked, harmed, or either physically or emotionally. If you have an asset of value and it is vulnerable and there is a threat, then you are a target. Threat, this first one, a statement of intent to inflict, that really doesn't apply except in the case of nation states or hacktivists, people that are doing things for non-economic reasons. That might be a threat. A person or thing likely to cause damage or danger. Two of the things at least in the IT field, that you have to identify for a threat is, number one, does the party or parties have a incentive or a motive to attack? And second, do they have the capability? Do they have the skill set required? We're going to talk about, there are basically four strategies that you can take with risk. You can transfer it, avoid it, accept, or reduce it. Our little mouse friend at the beginning with the helmet can reduce that risk. Transferring risk can be as simple as, we'll go back to the example of the risk of driving your car. You can transfer some of that risk to your insurance company. Okay, not so much the danger, the physical danger to you, but the economic impact. Avoiding, this can be taken 2 or 3 different ways. I just like the bird with his head in the sand. Avoiding, in the car example, what if you take an Uber, Lyft? What if you take the bus? What if you walk, ride a bicycle? You no longer have the economic liability of driving. However, you still have, you just move that risk to a different kind of risk. You can get hit by as a pedestrian, you can hit by a car, or you can have a crazy Uber driver. But this is a strategy that can be taken by business. They can just avoid those things that have risk. You can not take credit cards, so you don't have to worry about PCI DSS. No risk allowed. I actually missing a couple slides here. You can avoid risk. You can accept a risk. What if I simply say, I understand that by performing an act or taking credit cards, that there's a certain amount of risk, and I just accept that. I don't do anything to mitigate it. It's cost-wise, it's cheaper for me to accept that risk than it is to try to reduce it. And then finally reduce it, which is what most of what we do in IT security is. We try to reduce risk. We try to mitigate it in some form or fashion so the impact won't be as great. You can't ever eliminate it. Again, the question is not if you're going to be hacked, but when and how are you going to deal with it and minimize that? So those are the 4 things that we deal with risk. Do we accept the risk? Yes or no? If we don't accept the risk, we have to treat it in some way. Transfer it, mitigate it. We always are going to be walking that line, trying to balance risk versus a reward. In some cases, we may just try to block it off. In mitigating risk, we have to also be careful that sometimes that we can be get too broad with our mitigation techniques. They're basically there are 2 kinds of controls that you use in mitigating risk. One is logical or administrative, for example, policies. The other is technical. If you get carried away with firewall rules, for example, you can actually create more harm than good. Same thing with IDS or intrusion detection signature rules. There's no need to apply things that don't apply to your business. You're going to end up with a bunch of false positives. How do you filter those out and cut down your mitigation solution to fit your risk? Again, all these go together in risk management. You want to reduce it, share it, avoid it, or retain it. The next one we're going to talk about on these little series is the CIA triangle, which is basically the core objectives, the 3 things that you're really striving for in IT security. So, and we'll revisit that at a later time.